Path to Paradise is funded in part by Public Financial Management Incorporated, America's leading financial and investment advisors to state and local governments, helping to finance the schools, roads, and public facilities of the 21st century, and by Salomon Smith Barney, a global investment bank with offices around the world, including Carlsbad, La Jolla, Rancho Santa Fe, and 2 in the city of San Diego.
Good evening. I'm Shannon Bradley, the Public Affairs Producer for UCSD-TV. Tonight we begin a year-long series on urban planning in San Diego. After talking with many of you here on campus and in the community, we found that no issue stirred more passion than when we asked, what do you want this region to be? What's your vision for this land? So we decided to look into land use planning, what's been done, what's in the works, and what lies ahead. To make this series possible, we collaborated with Citizens Coordinate for Century 3, the region's oldest nonpartisan civic organization. I'd now like to introduce its president, Ken Sulzer.
Good evening. C3 is proud to join UCSD-TV in starting a conversation about the future of our region. Our interest is in keeping alive the legacy of Temporary Paradise, the visionary planning document for San Diego that is now nearly 25 years old. Temporary Paradise is a nationally acclaimed report that outlines principles that we believe are even more important today. You'll learn about Temporary Paradise tonight and more in the months to come. Citizens Coordinate for Century 3 has a long tradition of protecting the built and natural environments that make this region unique. At the end of the program, we'll tell you where to find us if you'd like more information.
And now we present to you Path to Paradise. San Diego, a region graced with physical beauty, abundant resources, and a booming economy. Some call it paradise, and others see paradise lost. They point to the clearing of pristine land to make room for houses, the congestion on the freeways, and lament the growth that has brought our population to nearly 3 million people. And more are coming. We'll be close to 4 million by the year 2020, with most of that growth coming from births, not immigrants. These are the facts, so how do we as a region respond? How do we make room for another million people and still preserve our precious land? We plan. But from the time the Indians met the Spaniards, visions for this land have clashed. Each wave of newcomers has brought new dreams for this waterfront city. Some were passed from grandfather to grandson, and others fell victim to the political winds and changing economies. This is the story of planning our paradise. A story that begins with the Kumeyaay.
The Kumeyaay Nation, my people, have lived here for over 10,000 years. It's kind of hard to really understand that. 10,000 years, a long time. Some people believe that the history of the world isn't even that long. But we have in our legends and in our music, within our bird songs, geological events that happened about 10,000 years ago in the eastern mountains of San Diego County, right here. And so somebody must have been around to see that stuff and to hear it and to see what happened. And so it was such drama that it was sung about, and today those songs are still with us. And we lived and flourished throughout the South San Diego County area and about 60 miles into the Mexican border, from the coast of California in San Diego County in northern Baja to the sand dunes of southeastern California.
This life continued for the Native Americans until the arrival of Juan Cabrillo, the first European to set foot in what is now San Diego. Cabrillo sailed into the bay in 1542, named it San Miguel, claimed the land for Spain, and continued his journey up the California coast. Next to arrive was Sebastian Vizcaíno, who renamed the land San Diego. It wasn't until 1769 that Spain sent teams to enforce its claim on the land.
When the decision was made to colonize California, what we think of as California, there were 4 expeditions actually sent out, 2 ships and 2 land expeditions. Father Serra went with the land expedition, as did the man who was in overall charge of the whole expedition and colonization, and that was Captain Gaspar de Portola.
Father Junipero Serra was the Franciscan priest who had built Catholic missions in Baja California.
He was a small man, but apparently had a great deal of energy and zeal and, you know, a survivor. And they founded a presidio, that is a military encampment, and a mission.
When the Spaniards came here, they were amazed at the abundance of the hills, and all the grass was there, and they said something like, "Oh, God surely led us to this place," as if that was a gift to them. They didn't really understand that the people caused that to happen, and so then there was then the eventual conflict between the cultures.
The Spanish came to save the Indians, and so that was really their whole attitude. And they
Lucy Calais earned her doctorate in history by studying land-use conflicts between the Indians and the Spaniards.
The conditions, the favorable conditions in Mission Valley, and there was a fairly large village there, and then there were others scattered around on up Mission Valley and up on the slopes. But by where they put the mission was probably destroyed some of the village there. But they brought the Indians into the missions and changed their diet completely, changed their whole life routine completely, broke off all of their kinship ties. In other words, they would be put with whoever happened to be handy for the missionaries to put them with, so it may be a perfect stranger. So it really disrupted their whole way of providing for each other. They don't provide for strangers or the enemy. And so this was kind of a difficulty.
The missions were, of course, not just churches, although the intent of the original Spanish laws governing the founding of the missions called for them to Hispanicize and Christianize the Indians, to turn them into colonists who would be farmers, perhaps blacksmiths, carpenters, other occupations as well, but essentially to do the farming and the shepherding of the sheep and the handling of the cattle, which were extremely important. And theoretically, the idea was that within 10 years, the missionaries should be able to complete this task, and then they would go back, perhaps to be sent out again to do something similar with other Indians.
But that's not what happened. Instead, while Father Serra went north to found other missions, his people stayed and continued to impose their will on the native population. The Indians resisted, and one night they struck back with an attack on Mission San Diego de Alcalá.
And there were at least over 1,000, which means they had to bring in Indians from other villages who were not closely related. So clearly there was a strong feeling among the Indians over a fairly wide area that this was what they considered an invasion, an enemy, and so on, and there's a group of people they had to get rid of because they had changed their whole way of life.
The mission burned, but the Europeans still prevailed over time. Native Americans died in droves from smallpox, measles, influenza, diseases to which they had no immunity. Sickness and war dwindled their population as title of the land passed from Spain to Mexico and eventually the United States.
What we call in American history books the Mexican War, and what the Mexicans frequently refer to as the North American Invasion, which it was, took place largely in 1846. And the objective for the Americans, in many ways, was to gain the coast of California and its harbors.
The Americans won the war against Mexico, and in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, they made sure that San Diego Bay was on the U.S. side of the border. The treaty also conferred 50,000 acres of government-owned property, known as the Pueblo lands, to city trustees, paving the way for men like Alonzo Horton to buy 1,000 acres in San Diego for $265.
Horton, so he tells us in his memoirs, went to a lecture one night on California and the beauties of the coast of California, and he heard San Diego described, and came home and said to his wife, I'm going to sell everything that I have and go to San Diego and build a city. And he did. That's the remarkable thing.
Horton didn't like the look of what we now call Old Town at the foot of Presidio Hill, so he invested in New Town.
Horton set aside a half a block of land to be a public park, and it's known as Horton Plaza. And right across from that, he built a hotel.
Horton hired a 20-year-old man to be the hotel's first clerk. His name was George White Marston. He later opened a dry goods store and began a lifelong commitment to building a beautiful San Diego.
He was interested in parks and urban planning. I suppose that perhaps one of the reasons for this is that he went to New York nearly every year on buying trips for his department store, and so he had an opportunity to see how a really big city was developing, and to see Central Park.
Marston was inspired by the City Beautiful movement, and one of its leaders, John Nolan, described here by Mike Stepner, Dean of San Diego's New School of Architecture.
And the City Beautiful movement was something that came about from the World's Fair of 1893 in Chicago. And people came away from that fair and said, cities should look like this. They should be beautiful. They shouldn't be industrial areas that just have no character, no charm, and are not very nice for the community. And John Nolan was a landscape architect from Cambridge, Massachusetts, who was a leading advocate of that and a planner, one of the first planners. And he was hired by George Marston, who felt that San Diego could be better than what it was. And at that time, San Diego firmly believed that it was going to grow to be the major city on the West Coast, and it had to have a setting that was befitting of that. Not only the beautiful natural setting, but the physical setting of the built environment as well.
John Nolan toured the region with Marston and Ed Fletcher, another big landowner, and while Nolan admired the backcountry, he found the city wanting.
San Diego is indeed unique. Even in Southern California, its situation, climate, and scenery make it stand out in permanent attractiveness. But San Diego is today neither interesting nor beautiful. Its city plan is not thoughtful, but on the contrary, ignorant and wasteful.
Nolan went to work and laid out a vision for this city that is to this day considered a classic.
This is the Nolan Plan from 1907. It was actually 1908 when it was published. And it's an original drawing. It's a watercolor and ink wash on paper mounted on canvas, which is the way they used to do things to preserve the drawings years ago. And it shows his overall scheme for the city of San Diego in 1908. And among the things it shows is a system of boulevards that ring the bay and that run throughout the city. Some boulevards are where I-5 now is and where 805 is at this time, and a series of boulevards downtown. And two of the important things I think it really points out is some of the earlier plans for the Paseo or the mall that linked the park to the bay, and this was to be lined with various public buildings. But the Civic Center was also to be down here, centered on Union and Front and Broadway and C Street, which was to be a civic plaza lined with public buildings. One of the things John Nolan felt very strongly about, and I guess George Marston as well, that the city should have a heart, and that the city should have a plaza. And this is part of the City Beautiful movement as well. All cities at the time were talking about civic plazas with the City Hall and other public buildings, and San Diego was not to be left behind. This was sort of the symbol or the icon of what a modern city would be in the early part of the century.
Another major suggestion was that we have not just Balboa Park, which was, of course, a very large, 1,400 acres park, but that we have a whole string, a whole series of parks stretching throughout the Pueblo lands up to Torrey Pines, for example, that special areas be selected and set aside for parkland before it was too late.
And essentially what you have here is another old drawing that's fading fast, but it shows a park-like series of blocks running from the Balboa Park down to the waterfront. And at the waterfront you had a number of public buildings that were mainly for entertainment rather than public buildings for civic use.
George Marston ran for mayor twice on the Nolan ideals. The last campaign was against banker and developer Louis Wilde.
Marston and Wilde had a campaign that has become famous in San Diego history because it pits the two positions against each other. It was called smokestacks versus geraniums. Marston was portrayed by the Wilde supporters as Geranium George. He's interested in parks and beautification and so on, but Wilde is going to bring us smokestacks, he's going to bring us industry and lots of money.
Marston lost both elections, but that didn't affect his commitment to urban planning or to John Nolan. Through his prodding, the City of San Diego commissioned Nolan to return and update his work.
Nolan recognized that a lot had happened in the ensuing 20 years that sort of shaped the city that he wasn't going to be able to change. You notice that many of the boulevards that he had proposed in this area are gone, although these sort of orangish areas are still some of the boulevards that he saw that could remain. But the city had expanded greatly to the east and began to fill in as you went to the south and even parts of the north of what is now I-8. He refined his boulevard system as he went into what is now Claremont and Kearny Mesa with parks and civic centers, which he didn't have in the first plan because this was nowhere. And then it goes further up north to the Torrey Pines area. He also did something that was, the civic center is no longer located in downtown because he then began to look at a waterfront scheme that would locate the civic center along the waterfront where the county administration building now is. He looked at the waterfront somehow as from about 8th Avenue south as being all industrial and north being civic and recreational. Airplanes came in. This is what is Municipal Airport, which is now Lindbergh Field, which is much, much larger, but this was just the airport at that time. He called for a major waterfront park to be along the water, which did not come into being.
Though the city adopted the 1926 Nolan Plan, only parts were followed. The Waterfront Civic Center was built some years later, and President Franklin Roosevelt came to celebrate its opening in 1938. But the vision of a tree-lined promenade, a Cedar Street mall connecting grand public buildings with the city park was never realized, and as the size of local government grew, the city eventually moved downtown. To Mike Stepner, though, the idea lives on.
The Beta Park is a proposal that is now talked about running from the park along 10th Avenue to the waterfront is a modification of Nolan's plan for the Cedar Street Mall, which ran either on Cedar or Date Street, depending on which scheme you look at, from the park to the waterfront. And over the years, that plan keeps coming back, and it has been proposed on 5th Avenue and on 12th Avenue, and now we're very seriously looking at it on 10th Avenue. And I think it can become a reality now as we try to revitalize Center City East, the discussions of the ballpark and the expansion of the convention center. It becomes a natural to try to make this link.
The Nolan Plan was the official city plan for 40 years. What changed the look of San Diego was not a new plan, but world events. The Navy increased its presence here, attracting the support industries and thousands of people who, when World War II ended, decided to stay. And the federal government, by building highways and providing loans to veterans for single-family homes, pushed growth to the suburbs. Other big changes, City Planning Director Glenn Rick took John Nolan's suggestion and developed Mission Bay into a recreational water park. And in Mission Valley, a controversial zoning change allowed shopping centers to be built on farmland, prompting one city council opponent to declare, "Thus died planning in San Diego." Voters did approve a general plan and progress guide in the 1960s, but Mike Stepner says it took a disaster like Mira Mesa for the region to get serious about planning.
When Mira Mesa first developed, we had pickets coming down here to City Hall every day because there were no schools and children were bused from Mira Mesa to Claremont and other places for schools. The fire station was a single-family home that had been converted to a fire station. In fact, some of the classes were taught in model homes because that was all there was. And so the people rightly felt very strongly that something had to be done.
And politicians took notice.
In 1971, there was a campaign for mayor. Frank Curran had been a two-term mayor of San Diego. Pete Wilson, then a state assemblyman, decided to run for mayor of San Diego, and he ran on a platform of growth management. There were a number of issues that had already arisen in the city around the development of Mira Mesa, conversations around the development of Rancho Penasquitos and Rancho Bernardo, and those issues became focused in the mayoral campaign of 1971. Pete was elected in November of '71 and set about to develop a growth management plan for San Diego as a part of his keeping his promises for the 1971 campaign.
Wilson had an important community ally in urban planning who stepped forward with an offer. That ally was Hamilton Marston, the grandson of George Marston.
He liked to talk about planning. He liked to talk about the Nolan Plan. You know, he's very proud of that. And what he wanted to do was to provide the next plan which would succeed Nolan's plan or follow up on it. He felt his grandfather had did this thing and he was encouraged to do likewise. And so he came and he said, look, you know, I want to have a reconnaissance. He called it a reconnaissance of San Diego to determine where we've been, where we are, and where we could go.
Mr. Marston offered Pete the private financing to update what the Marstons had previously done by bringing a man named Nolan to San Diego a good many years earlier, and there are various people today who will quote the Nolan plans for San Diego with some great affection. That offer by Mr. Marston was accepted by the mayor and council. It resulted in the hiring of two gentlemen, a man named Kevin Lynch from MIT and a man named Don Appleyard from the University of California at Berkeley. And they produced a qualitative document for the growth and future of San Diego, which document became known as Temporary Paradise.
And I suggested Kevin Lynch because I felt that he was an urban planner who also was very sensitive to the environment and that he would recognize the amenities of San Diego and put the two together, the man-made and the natural. And indeed, I think that's what he did in Temporary Paradise.
Lynch and Appleyard studied the region, much like Nolan had done a half-century earlier.
Their initial orientation was a helicopter ride, and I had the privilege of going with them on that ride, which took us from the border all the way up the coastal plain to Lake Hodges. And their impression was they were awed. You know, they could not believe the way in which the mesa, flat as it was interrupted with all of these canyons, dry rivers. The diversity of the terrain was what struck them. The Peninsula Mountains, you know, about 15, 20 miles inland, the ocean, and then this plain, and bisected at regular intervals with dry river valleys.
They really did an analysis of what was out here, a reconnaissance, if you will, to look at the nature of the community, where growth was occurring, what the impacts of growth were, and they talked about what they found. And one of the interesting things they found is identifying the topography and how we go from a sea-coast plain to foothills to mesa tops to mountains. And so there's this topographic scale that goes from west to east. They also were very impressed with the economic scale they found, running from south to north, with generally lower incomes on the southern end of the city, and as you go north, the incomes and the affluence increases. And that gave them a sort of a physical and demographic framework to work with.
Lynch and Appleyard's report focused on how to celebrate the unique physical layout of San Diego while accommodating, even encouraging, its growth. The principles outlined in Temporary Paradise are organized into 7 areas: valleys and canyons, the seacoast, older neighborhoods, major centers, growth where, getting about, and the Mexican connection. Max Schmidt and Mike Stepner worked for the City Planning Department at that time and explain here the ideas of Temporary Paradise.
The valleys and the canyons really begin to give identity to the city. They form neighborhoods, they divide areas one from another, but divide in a way that's a green link, if you will.
Well, see, they conceptualized the coastal plain as being part of a 2-tiered city, that the mesas could develop and the canyons were natural gardens and open spaces because they had groundwater and vegetation, and they interrupted the coastal plain at intervals, and that interruption provided an opportunity for communities which adjoined those canyons to have a sense of integrity of place, you know, that it doesn't, that these communities do not sprawl out over the landscape. And so they felt that mesas would develop and canyons would remain free. They didn't even want transportation systems in canyons. Of course, that part of their concept, you know, wasn't followed through because practically every canyon in this area has a freeway down it. To the rule of Mission Valley, for example, they thought Mission Valley was a disaster and a bad example of urban planning, but they felt that the canyons provided a natural built-in garden park space for the city. They felt basically that the waterfront belonged to everyone. It belonged to El Cajon and La Mesa and Poway and people inland, and that whereas, you know, they realized that access was important and that people, Easterners, had to come through the coastal communities to get to the water, they nevertheless felt that it should be accessible and it should not be a linear development of high-rise as part of San Diego Bay is now becoming.
The scale and height and bulk of buildings, that there should be specialized design controls so that the buildings fit with the waterfront. They step back from the waterfront, that they didn't overpower the waterfront. They looked at some prime examples around Mission Bay Park where the buildings have gone right up to the water and were out of scale, and you lost the beaches, you lost access to the water, and they felt very strongly that the city had to work to retain that and to acquire as much access back on the waterfront as possible. They wanted to only allow uses along the waterfront that were really appropriate to the waterfront and remove uses that were not appropriate. They looked at some of the things that were industrial, that could just as well be in Kearny Mesa or be anywhere else in the city. They didn't rely on the waterfront at all, and they wanted to think about moving those. Prime among those was the airport and the military bases. MCRD and NTC primarily as military bases because they didn't really require waterfront in order to train the troops.
I'm afraid to hit on some very hot political
Lee Grissom
issues in San
pushed
Diego
Kevin
right
Lynch
now.
on this
We'll talk
point
about a
in a
couple of things.
1974
One,
interview.
The airport. You would very definitely propose that it be moved out of the downtown area, out of its Lindbergh field site, to some other area in San Diego.
Yeah. That's our principal point, is that it's in the wrong location now where it is, impacting with its noise so many people, the safety questions, but also the fact that it's occupying a location which is crucial to the future growth of the city. One of the finest residential sites that you have is the North Island and the Lindbergh Field site. And if you're really serious about controlling growth in the outer suburbs, then the place to grow is around the bay. And there's place there for 250,000 people. So that's our principal point, is that it does not belong there in the long run.
They felt that the older neighborhoods provided the affordable housing 25 years ago for the city of San Diego, and they would probably stress that even more now. They felt that the older communities, by and large, they contained infrastructure. The infrastructure needed updating. They felt that the older communities could be a resource for additional housing, for additional development, for increased density. Now that's a good planning ideal or model, but that's not what the neighborhoods thought ought to happen in the neighborhoods. The neighborhoods felt that, you know, we've got all of the traffic, the congestion that we can handle. We have a lousy infrastructure. The sewer and water is in bad shape. We don't have parks, libraries, schools, you name it. So why do you want to pile in more density into our communities? And so there's quite a bit of resistance to that idea, but nevertheless, that concept has been implemented in part.
There's a tremendous shortfall in public facilities and services in those older neighborhoods that need to be upgraded to make them more livable communities. And even though many of the areas are zoned for multifamily, the multifamily that's been built has been poor quality and without adequate services. The community, rightly so, has reacted to the densities that have gone in. I don't really think it's the density per se. It's the fact that we have not kept pace with the development needs and the quality of the development until recently to make those density changes acceptable. If you look at some older neighborhoods where there are higher densities, the people don't know it because the services are there, the scale of the buildings, the landscaping, everything else seems to mitigate that. In other areas, we see that it isn't. Two examples that I give sometimes are Mission Hills, which looks like a low-density single-family area, and it is, but it's about 12 to 14 units per acre, which is quite high for a single-family residential neighborhood. Normally, they're about 5 units per acre. And then you look at Pacific Beach, which is about 25 units per acre, and because of the quality of development and the scale and the traffic, it really seems overpowering, overwhelming at times. And I think it's the quality of how it's done, not so much the numbers.
It should be the center of business, government, commerce, entertainment, transportation, recreation, tourism, all of those things. Now, in part, downtown does that, but it also shares with a lot of other areas, you know, for retail particularly, like the University Town Center and Mission Valley.
They looked at the major centers, and the reason that they did that is because San Diego had grown. Downtown was no longer the dominant center. There were other centers that were occurring, primarily Mission Valley and UTC at the time. And they didn't say too much about downtown, except that the city should continue with its plans that were then underway to redevelop downtown. But they really focused on Mission Valley as a key area, looking at what had happened to Mission Valley, that a few years earlier it had been farmland, and now it was being filled with shopping centers and parking lots. And they raised a couple of interesting points, in some of which they were just reporting on what was happening, and some of which were their new ones. One of the things that had happened was the city had fought, the community had fought from turning Mission Valley into the equivalent of the LA River with a concrete flood control ditch running through it. So the channel bed had at least been preserved. And so we had that to start with. But they started looking at what could happen, given the fact that we had a lot of shopping centers down there, what could happen and what should happen to the valley. And they made a number of proposals. And interestingly enough, many of them are coming true right now. The trolley runs through there providing service, transit service to the area, which helps mitigate the traffic that overloads I-8 and Friars Road. Shopping centers have gone in, and new construction has gone in that begins to respect the fact that the river's there. The river is being restored both to a natural state and to a park-like state. Housing is going in to create neighborhoods. And I think Mission Valley in a few years can really be a very important center that doesn't look like a large commercial strip. They looked at the growth patterns in San Diego, and San Diego at that point was growing rapidly, spreading out the I-15 corridor, which when they first got here was a lot of farmland and grazing areas. By the time they were ready to leave, there was a lot of approved subdivisions that were going in all up and down I-15. And the same was happening in the north area along I-5. And they were concerned about the quality of growth that was happening. At that point, we were leveling mesas and hilltops and filling canyons, and some areas like Mira Mesa were just unrelieved single-family development with very inaccessible traffic patterns and no services. Sure, this was a proposal for how new suburbs, and I-15 was developing at the time that they were producing this report, so they talked about the kind of development that should occur there. And primarily was to concentrate development on the mesas and use a more suitable form of development for the kind of climate and the kind of topography we have here rather than the spread out typical suburban subdivision. What they have here is houses clustered around a civic center or park-like center for the community, smaller lots, houses designed to take advantage of solar energy, to take advantage of the shading, to keep the houses cool in summer and warm in winter. The canyons are to be preserved in their natural open space or as agriculture or as golf courses or as walking areas, but to preserve also the riparian vegetation that occurs in some of these areas. Finding ways so that pedestrians could come down to the valley from the mesa tops above and putting things like children's vegetable gardens in here. Using secondary treatment plant for irrigation of the valley so that you use recycled water to help water the plants and the orchards that occur here. It was really a proposal for really looking at a more suitable form of suburban development for the city of San Diego. They talked about the transit system and the need to put a transit system in. In fact, they recommended the transit system should be above grade and not in a subway as other areas are proposing, because they felt that people should be able to see the areas they were passing through because they would get to know the city better and they would assume ownership or feel part of the cities and neighborhoods they went through.
They also were an advocate of other modes of transportation like, well, walking is a mode of transportation. They like footpaths, you know, and they like bicycles. And they generally, you know, de-emphasized reliability or reliance on automobiles.
And what some consider the most progressive idea in temporary paradise, others dismissed as too radical, and that was the Mexican connection.
One of the peculiar things when we first came here was to find a base map that covered both the U.S. side of the border and the Mexican side of the border. All the maps stopped at the border line. It's as though both governments were in the fence, weren't looking across the landscape, and yet it's all one natural region and it's all one social region. The city of Tijuana is probably growing as fast or maybe even faster than any other city in the world. It's got a tremendous annual growth rate. People are pouring in from all over Mexico for the relatively high incomes that are there. The region is facing a tremendous problem, which maybe isn't quite recognized yet, of vast growth, of unemployment and poverty right across the line. And also, on the other hand, that's what seems to us to be the really unique characteristic of this region, the fact that it's bicultural, and the tremendous potentialities that come from that. We found that to be one of the most striking things about the area.
They felt that Mexico Tijuana was a part of this region, you know, and that we should think more in the macro sense of San Diego, the city, Tijuana, the city, all the cities of San Diego County, and address issues on a regional basis.
Stepner says this was met with some resistance.
That way, that even though intellectually the community always knew that Mexico was down there and it was a tourist place, that from emotionally, they always reacted against having anything to do with it. But the fact of the matter was that we shared air basins and water basins, and we shared jobs, and our economies were interdependent, and that we better really start working together. And this is a theme that was picked up later on by a number of people, including Lucy Gayle when she headed up the Fronteras group, which was sort of an outgrowth of this.
And there was no connection at all in the planning or view of either side of what we might look like in a more regional sense. So this
Lucy Gayle was the first to lead Fronteras de las Californias.
Liaison primarily with local government and local groups in Tijuana and with Fronteras on our side of the border, bringing together people for conferences and getting people together on more practical solutions, whether they were city engineers or the new fire chief coming in and need to meet the people down there, so on and so forth. This was the kind of connection we were making, which was considered rather unusual at that time, to put it mildly.
Temporary Paradise was completed in 1974 and published on newsprint in English and Spanish and distributed widely throughout the region. Madigan in the mayor's office welcomed Temporary Paradise as a complement to their draft of a practical growth management plan.
It was a couple of things. One, it was a very interesting exercise to go through because it required a number of people who were in fact thinking about the more quantitative aspects of the growth of San Diego and the development of San Diego and the open space system of San Diego and things like that, to think about the qualitative side of the house. And it became a document that got some fair amount of public distribution and recognition and discussion as it was being developed and for a period of time after it was produced. It got some fairly wide distribution, and I thought it was an excellent exercise for the city. I don't think that everything that Lynch and Appleyard proposed were with the idea that this is absolutely what you should do. But they were thoughtful ideas. For example, the notion of the reuse of Lindbergh Field, given that San Diego's airport would ultimately wind up someplace else. Well, of course, San Diego's airport has not, at this exact moment, wound up someplace else. But the ideas that they had for the reuse of Lindbergh Field were useful notions, and you now see that Mayor Golding has proposed the bay-to-bay planning effort, and in some measure that has at its heart the notions that Lynch and Appleyard were looking at, and the reuse of large pieces of property in many instances in government ownership, and what should happen to them once those government uses were no longer priorities. So while the Lynch-Appleyard high-density residential community on Lindbergh was perhaps a little bit fanciful, the idea that that area should be looked at and considered important in the future of San Diego, both as a way of enhancing the core and making it more attractive and taking some of the pressure off of the development in the hinterlands of San Diego County, are both pretty serviceable notions.
Temporary Paradise did not become an official document, though there were shades of Lynch in Wilson's multi-tiered general plan.
There was then a Tier 2 of the older urbanized communities of San Diego, where the notion in Temporary Paradise, but also within the planning department of the city, was that higher densities were appropriate. And much of that densification took place. And the idea was that if you encouraged it by not having the same level of fees, and you encourage the utilization of existing public facilities, that you would not require the premature extension of public facilities or services into the hinterlands. That took place, I think, at a greater rate than we had anticipated, and probably if we had made a serious mistake in the growth management plan, that's where we made it, because we didn't recognize well enough that some of those public facilities were not adequate for the growth that occurred. We should have been planning for additional park space, better libraries, upgraded water and sewer lines, improved streets, higher levels of public transit. We should have appreciated that the market really was there for those higher densities and done a better job of planning for it.
Well, the growth, even though we had these discussions and proposals from Lynch and the Appleyard, and some were incorporated into the general plan, into the zoning ordinance, growth has still occurred at a rapid pace, and we have low-density growth that has filled in a lot of areas that were not originally proposed to have that kind of growth. And it's put a severe strain on our public services and facilities, which we're still dealing with. And all the discussion today about I-15 and the traffic patterns and the congestion and the call for moratoriums, in some ways are a direct result of not following some of these suggestions 20 years ago.
The commitment to planning has vacillated as San Diego has gone from boom to bust to boom again in the last 2 decades.
In the 1980s, when growth was just overwhelming the community, planning was very important, but the focus shifted to, in many cases, to how you slow down growth and how you begin to stop what was perceived as rampant growth and the quality that was not quite what everybody wanted. People would drive up I-15 one way, and they'd see houses going in, and by the time they came back the other way, at the end of the day, it seemed like a whole new subdivision had already gone in, that it was changing before their eyes. And so the focus became on regulation, and the idea of policy planning sort of got lost in the growth management wars of the late 80s.
But the planners were outmatched by development interests. And then, in 1991, an in-house scandal demoralized the department even further. The planning director at the time had an affair with an employee and tried to buy her silence with city funds. When the incident became public, he was fired, and the entire planning department lost its special status of reporting to the mayor and council and was put under the direction of then city manager Jack McGrory. A culture clash followed.
There's a certain culture among city planners that they like to think that they are independently charged with the protection of the trust of the land in some way, and that they don't have to work for anybody or with anybody in that process. I mean, that's kind of the extreme view of city planning.
And, Jack had been also convinced, as had a lot of the politicians, that planning was negative. Planning was, let's stop this thing. Let's see how many plants and animals we can find to stop the project. So he reorganized the whole shooting match again. He put everybody under the manager again as one of many reorganizations. But this time around, he took the word planning out of everything. It just didn't even exist. And what used to be known as planning became community and economic development and so forth.
Yeah, that was a deliberate effort. I mean, there was a certain, I'll be the first to admit, I mean, one of the things I had to do, I felt in the first couple of years, was really to break the independent culture and to make them part of the team. And the more that we did that, I felt the better that we would be long term. And so they became part of community and neighborhood services. Part of them, the planners, became part of community and neighborhood services. And the key word was service. That was a unique concept for some of the planners, that they would actually serve the community and not dictate to the community.
And in that process, the city manager kept lowering the role of planning as the years went by. Where it originally was to be an assistant to the city manager, it later became somebody who reported to a deputy city manager. And that was really the voice, the policy direction, and some of the issues that should have been brought up to the council for discussion were lost because they were filtered through a managerial point of view.
Clearly there was a no-growth sentiment for a while that began to develop in the 1980s, and one way to do that was to lay as much regulation as possible into the land use process, to the point where when we began to look at it in the early 90s, we had 14,000 pages of land use rules and regulations, many of them totally inconsistent from one neighborhood to the next, and a lot of conflicting policies that created, a pretty Byzantine type of land use process for developers to try to get through.
The recession had hit by then, so McGrory focused on jobs.
We ended up as a community basically seeing a complete restructuring of our economy. And as a result of that, you know, us having to really take a good hard look at what is going to make San Diego grow in the future, grow into the next century. And we began to realize it was going to be Biotech and Biomed and the high-tech firms that we really had to establish a close partnership with and help them get through the building permit process as fast as we could. I mean, and we wanted to see overnight permits being issued to companies that were in those targeted areas so that they could begin to expand. Now, a lot of community groups and a lot of planners thought that was the worst thing that could ever happen. God, we're not going to be able to tinker and play with this building and do what we normally do to it and make it an 18-month process. We had to get projects out overnight. Anything that was going to create jobs, we had to move on because, frankly, it became that critical for us to get the economy back up on its feet again. And in the process, we started ripping the hell out of the 1980s land use process that had been established.
For developers like Madigan, the streamline was welcomed.
It began to give some focus because all of the activities were under someone again, whereas maybe they had been under Pete Wilson in the 70s. They sort of became under the city manager in 1990 or whenever the time was. So it at least allowed you to understand how the decisions were going to be made and what the appeal process was, and it began to give some guidance and shape to the planning process.
But to Lucy Calais, the restructure reduced the value of long-term planning.
The importance of business and business aims, which are very important for our economy and for our welfare and for jobs, has taken over so completely that it has pretty well eliminated any kind of opposition to development that business interests want to go ahead with and that they want to promote.
I think the real cost was sort of a lack of an overall vision and coordination and a lack of any kind of leadership about where the city should go and what we should be doing and who should be doing it. There was a distinct morale problem in the planning department, which made life really hard for us out here also because you never knew what you were going to run into. But I think that was also just a result of, gee, we're supposed to be doing planning. I mean, where is it? We're shuffling papers around. We're not really thinking about where we're going. There was nobody to get out ahead of it and sort of lead the charge.
It finally got down to, I thought it was kind of a bizarre discussion at the end because it finally got down to is, Jack, you need to appoint somebody to be city planner. And I said, what exactly do you think that's going to accomplish? And I've got a person who's in charge of community planning. At that time it was Betsy McCulloch. She's in charge of the community planning effort. I've got Mike Stepner sitting in long-range planning, who's responsible for long-range planning like the Naval Training Center and the future urbanizing area and some of the major projects that we had. Why am I going to add a third person to this, call him city planner, and somehow that's going to make all of you so happy that something else is going to go on, and I'm not even sure what that something else is other than you want the title planner in somebody's job title within the city structure. And I said, you know, I can do that at any point. I just don't understand what it's going to get. It's form over substance, and I'm just not.
McGrory resigned in 1997 to develop real estate for Saul Price, and Mark Steele, at Susan Golding's request, became chairman of the San Diego City Planning Commission. He urged the appointment of an official city planner, and that job went to Gayle Goldberg, a 10-year veteran of City Hall. Her first task, revise the general plan.
And the general plan in 1979 was adopted when San Diego was largely undeveloped, and for the most part sort of laid out policies for developing new land and providing infrastructure and facilities in new development. And we're now faced with the prospect of only about 12% of the land in San Diego undeveloped, and with 1 million new folks being in San Diego or added to our population in the next 20 years, we really are going to have to look at how to redevelop San Diego and how to increase densities and how to accommodate people in a way that will still maintain the quality of life that we're all very used to here in San Diego.
And to be successful, Goldberg says public support is critical.
I see the planning department as being a facilitator for planning in the communities to help empower communities to play a stronger role and have more of a voice in their own sort of destiny in San Diego. And the planning commissioners are very enthusiastic about that too. And I think that we all want to help San Diegans understand planning and play a stronger role. So we're going to be working together to make that happen.
Goldberg, of course, speaks for the city of San Diego, but it will take all of us in the county, in the many smaller cities, and in Tijuana to develop a comprehensive vision for the region, a vision of balance in which we protect our land while we prosper in our paradise. We covered a lot of ground tonight, 9 interviews from Anthony Pico to Gayle Goldberg, and now we want to hear your vision for the future of this region, which we will include in subsequent programs. Send your thoughts to Paradise, UCSD-TV, 9500 Gilman Drive, La Jolla, California, 92093-0176, or call us on our viewer response line, 619-534-7076.
And for more information about Citizens Coordinate for Century 3, or if you'd like a copy of Temporary Paradise, you can get a hold of us at 619-232-7196, or write to us at C3, Post Office Box 121028, San Diego, California, 92112-1028.
That concludes our broadcast tonight. Next time on Path to Paradise, we'll look at 3 of the planning issues on the November ballot: the ballpark, housing in Carmel Valley, and the Rural Heritage and Watershed Initiative. We hope to see you then. Thank you and good night.
Funding for Path to Paradise is provided in part by Salomon Smith Barney, a global investment bank with offices around the world, including Carlsbad, La Jolla, Rancho Santa Fe, and 2 in the city of San Diego. Salomon Smith Barney is a leading underwriter of municipal bonds in the U.S. and stands ready to help all San Diego area municipalities with their tax-exempt financing needs. And by Public Financial Management Incorporated, America's leading financial and investment advisors to state and local governments. Since 1975, PFM has been proud to play a role in financing the facilities that make San Diego County a better place to live, work, and travel.